welcome everybody. First and foremost, I hope this presentation is going to be a useful expenditure of your time. It's about a topic that has become quite important the last few years. This is the third time, in fact, I'm giving this lecture, but it's amazing every time I come in how much additional material pops up and what staggering statistics I can share with you. So what I plan to cover tonight in the course of the next hour and a half or so are the following. First of all, I want to put some focus on cybersecurity in terms of some of the news and some huge numbers that would be of interest to everybody to hear. Then we're going to go through a basic definition of what cybersecurity is. I think it's very important to understand what is cybersecurity supposed to address before we start talking about the other items. Then for those of you who have been in IT, information technology, you've heard the term best practices. So this is what vendors, software manufacturers, hardware manufacturers, consultants have come up with in terms of what is considered to be best practices, things that's supposed to work, things that you're supposed to handle to make sure that you have a safe environment. We'll then go over talking about some of the common types of cybersecurity threats that exist today and have existed in the past. We'll address three important attacks: man in the middle, distributed denial of service, and DNS spoofing attacks. We'll then talk about a term that probably a lot of you have already heard of, which is firewalls. Then we discuss intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems. No conversation about security is complete without having to talk about mobile devices. Those phones, those tablets, and everything else that we carry with us, they are a separate word by themselves that we need to make sure we properly address and we properly handle. And as you probably heard the term IoT, Internet of Things, we will also address that. This by itself brings major challenges. And then we're going to talk about this concept of data in transit and data at rest, what that means and what the implications are. If you have been listening to the news, if you've been watching the IT companies, and if you look at revenues from companies such as Microsoft and Amazon, and in fact also IBM, you will notice that there has been tremendous, and tremendous with an underline and bold, in the cloud era. So we're going to talk about a little bit about what cloud is, but more specific about how to handle cybersecurity in the cloud era. Typically, any security discussion or any cybersecurity discussion specifically is not complete without discussing regulatory requirements. As you know, each government, each country, they try to protect their own interests. As a result, they come up with certain regulations to make sure information is not put at danger. Last but not least, Payam and the rest of the Torah College team will not be happy with me if I don't tell you how we handle cybersecurity education at Torah, or essentially the courses that you need to be taking to prepare yourself for a career. So hopefully this agenda for the course of the next 90 minutes or so will be a useful expenditure of time for everybody. So without further ado, let's start talking about some cybersecurity in focus. First and foremost, last year, because of the start of the pandemic, it ended up breaking all kinds of records as far as breaches are concerned. Not only breaches, but also data that was lost because of these breaches. And this impacted not only companies, it impacted governments as well as individuals. One thing that has definitely happened is the threats have become more sophisticated. And not only that, because the usage of technology among users, companies have raised, that has brought additional challenges. So you probably always hear about machine learning. You hear about AI, artificial intelligence, where companies like Google, Microsoft, and IBM are hard at work in this area. And if you have bought the latest and greatest phone, you're all familiar with 5G. So by all means, all of these are considered to be emerging technologies, and they have brought their own challenges. And what you also notice here is that data breaches that have taken place have resulted in major financial impacts on hospitals. I bring up hospitals, as you can imagine, over the course of the last 14 months or so, we have been depending on the functionality of the hospitals. And one report has essentially said, this is very staggering, 90% of all healthcare organizations have reported at least one security breach in the last 3 years. So imagine your health records are at danger when I mention this. So some more statistics, sobering statistics. Last year, the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, received almost 1.5 million reports of identity theft, and that was double from the year before. And what I also want to share here with you is that cybercrime is going to cost the world, not just United States, the world, $10.5 trillion. We have million, billion, and then trillion. So 10.5 followed by 12 zeros. And I put a hyperlink there for those who are interested to read that report. And if you want to look at a simplification of the math, almost $3 million every minute is lost to cybercrime. And top companies essentially pay $25 per minute, not per hour, because of all the cybersecurity breaches. And yet, I didn't make these numbers up. I have 2 hyperlinks that I encourage you to visit on your own. So, those are all nice and dandy, but the question comes in, what's in it for me? If I become a cybersecurity expert, does this pay enough for me? So I'm here to share some numbers with you from University of San Diego, and they have a program there for cybersecurity. And these are the latest numbers, latest figures. And I just put on some values there, so hopefully make you appreciate what this career can do for you. There is a position called bug bounty specialist. These are the folks that can actually look in the code and find out where is a defect on a particular code reside. Then, and these folks can go all the way up to $500,000, and some of these are for the elite folks, of course. CIO, or Chief Information Security Officer, sometimes they call it CISO. The median salary for that is $140,000. So, and again, when I say median, half of the folks are above, half of them are below. Depending on where they are located, software security engineers make about $225,000 a year. And so on and so forth. You see the numbers for yourself. So the point I'm trying to make on this slide is that this is a career that is going to pay well. I can guarantee you, although there's no guarantees in life, that because of additional usage of IoT, Internet of Things, because of our reliance on mobile devices, and because of the fact that IT is going to continue to expand, there's going to be more and more demand for cybersecurity professionals. At the end of this presentation, I'm going to go through what are the kind of courses that Touro College offers to prepare you for this career. So let's talk about the definition, as I promised. I put in here 2 definitions so you can see the perspective of a government agency, which is the one on top, and the one from a leader in networking technology called Cisco. NIST is National Institute of Standards and Technology. They are a division of United States Department of Commerce. So they essentially are a nonprofit organization, as you can imagine. They do not endorse any vendors. However, they establish standards for the United States government. So NIST calls cybersecurity prevention of damage or protection and restoration of computers, electronic communication systems, wire communication, electronic communication, as well as any information that is obtained. And what they also go on to talk about, and we'll talk about this in the next few slides, is to address the three important components of security: confidentiality, integrity, and availability, what we call CIA of security, as well as non-repudiation. Cisco has a little bit of a easier definition, and they talk about the fact that cybersecurity is a practice of protecting your systems, your networks, and your programs from digital attacks. So what do these cyber attacks are meant to do? They are meant to access the systems, access the data, access the programs, change any of these data, potentially destroy that. In some of the more severe cases, extort money from the users, as you're going to hear in a few minutes. And a lot of times they want to interrupt normal business processes. And because the number of devices continue to increase, and because attackers are becoming more innovative and sophisticated, implementing effective cybersecurity measures are becoming more and more challenging. So, what is the cybersecurity approach all about? I talk about this in my MSIS 641 Advanced Data Communication course, but essentially, the idea of a successful cybersecurity is to make sure you have built multiple layers of protection. By that, I mean defense in depth. And by defense in depth, you spread the security across multiple layers, multiple computers, not only computers, but also your networks, programs that run on those networks, and data that those programs produce. And the idea is to keep these safe. So how do we make that happen? Within an organization, there are three key components that have to work hand in hand to make sure you can build an effective defense against these cyber attacks. Those three components are people, processes, technology. All three have to be successful to be able to build an effective defense. And because cyber attacks can happen anytime, anywhere, without notice, even though we might have the latest technology, but latest technology can only go so far. You can spend all the greatest amount of money to buy the best and the greatest technology from all the best companies in the world. But ultimately, if your users are careless, you're losing that defense. So you want to make sure your users know what they have to do. Users have to be properly educated. Users have to understand what they're up against. So let's talk about a little bit about this people, process, and technology. Again, majority of the companies, I can tell you for a fact at IBM, every year we have to go through a cybersecurity education, and we have to certify that we have gone through that. And we also given a quiz at the end of it. So people have to understand and comply with basic data security principles. Some of them you're already well aware of them, such as make sure you use strong passwords. Be aware of attachments that are loaded in emails, particularly if they're zip files. Be careful about clicking on URLs, links in emails. And you want to make sure you properly back up your data in case your data is corrupted or compromised. So this is the responsibility of the end users. And please understand that your IT department can only go so far. The rest is up to the actual people and actual users. From a processes perspective, organizations have to have a framework of how they want to deal with these cyber attacks. They have to have, first of all, a security policy. And the security policy has to explain, how are we going to identify our attacks? How are we going to protect our systems? How precious are our systems? What happens if our data is compromised? Do we have disaster recovery capabilities built in our environment? So you notice it's just more than just security. It's about networking, your servers, your applications, everything. And last component, people, process, technology. Technology is really essential to provide the tools that are needed to protect these companies from cyber attacks. So again, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, you want to make sure your endpoint devices are protected. Endpoint devices are not just desktops. They're everything that a user has. And I can just speak about myself. I have a laptop, I have a tablet, I have a phone. That's already 3 devices. 15, 20 years ago, I probably only had 1 device. So you can see the devices have proliferated significantly. So what are some of the common technology tools that we use? Next generation firewall is one. We're going to talk about that briefly. DNS filtering, we have a separate slide on that. Malware protection, which everybody's familiar with. Malware is another glorious term for antivirus. Malware protection, malware is more than antivirus. In fact, it's about tons of other components, such as Trojan horse, such as worms. And finally, because we are all becoming so dependent, or we have become dependent on email, there needs to be proper email security solutions from technology. So you see the importance of the people, process, technology as we go through this cybersecurity journey. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago, and in some of the elementary security courses, they typically talk about the 3 fundamental principles of security. They are confidentiality, integrity, and availability. CIA. You need to understand these 3 terms in order to be able to properly protect yourself and prepare to protect yourself. And the reason I brought these 3 layers here is because at NIST, that government agency that sets up IT and security standards, these 3 tiers are defined within a document, which I'm providing you a link to it. And that document is called An Introduction to Information Security. I encourage you to read that document, download it, and keep it as one of your references. Again, there is no vendor information. They talk about security in general. So what do these 3 terms mean? Confidentiality means I want to keep my data and information restricted. And I want to make sure I keep it secured. You can probably equate confidentiality with encryption, but there's a lot more than just encryption as far as confidentiality is concerned. You know, like in the days when we had paper prevalent, we used to write, this is top secret, confidential, limited access, things of that nature. In the IT world, that's what confidentiality means. The next term, the letter I in the CIA, stands for integrity. This is not only data integrity, it's also system integrity. The whole idea is to be able to guard against somebody modifying your data, or about somebody destroying your data, or impacting the reliability of the data. You all have heard the term garbage in, garbage out. If your data becomes garbage, what you produce is going to be garbage. So that's why the integrity of the data is so important. Next, the A stands for availability. Availability talks about the fact that I have the need to get my data and information without disruption. Because we have become so dependent on IT, on our devices, and on the data that's on them, if you ever hear the system is down, server has crashed, or because we're applying a patch and you cannot log on for next 24 hours, those are just not acceptable this day and age. And again, because the computing landscape has changed, availability has got to make sure that we keep our systems available. And in fact, if you have ever listened or followed the cloud providers like Microsoft, Azure, Amazon AWS, or IBM, you'll find out that they go to excruciating details to make that their data centers have availability within them. And data centers are replicated to within regions. So in case a region becomes unavailable, you can access that accordingly. Now, a company's business objectives are going to dictate which one of these three we have to focus, or maybe they're all focused at the same rate. A good example of this could be an e-commerce organization that could be focused on availability. We have to have our systems available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, probably 99.999% availability, which essentially means no more down no more than 5 minutes a year. And because money comes in, money goes out. People probably trade stocks. That's a good example of it. On the other hand, a small healthcare organization could be focused on confidentiality of key patient information. In other words, they want to make sure the patient information is not falling into the wrong hands, because not only that is embarrassing, it's also going to carry significant financial penalties for that healthcare agency. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the next topic, which is what are some of the common types of cybersecurity threats that these companies want to fight? Let's talk about the first one, phishing. And this icon essentially describes what phishing is all about. The idea of phishing is that, excuse me, some organization or organizations are going to be sending fraudulent email. And these emails make you believe that they're coming from reputable sources. But in reality, they're meant to steal your data. That data could be your credit card numbers, could be your user logon information to some other system. And with some common measures, users should be able to stop phishing attempts. If not stop, at least eliminate majority of them. And the way users can do that is through proper education. Maybe they should read some of the material, listen to what's going on, and companies having appropriate email filtering solutions. Typically, emailing filter solutions are not only stored at the company's perimeter, on the company's network, there are also email filtering solutions installed on the user's devices, not just laptops, but also on their mobile devices as well. Next, as far as cybersecurity threat, is a ransomware. And this icon, I think, properly depicts this. Ransomware is another example of malware or malicious software. The idea of ransomware is to extort money from you as the end user. And how do they do that? They connect to your system and they block your access to the files or the computer general. And the way that's going to be blocked is that you generally have to pay a ransom, some dollar amount. Now, the worst thing about this is, even after you pay the ransom, there is no guarantee that these files are going to be removed or even you're going to gain access to your system. The other one that we have already kind of touched upon is malware. Malware is essentially the abbreviation of two terms, malformed software. This is covered in our GCO 231 course. Malware is essentially a type of a software whose purpose is to gain unauthorized access to a computer or perhaps cause damage to your computer. And the last part of this common cybersecurity threats that you probably have heard the terminology is social engineering. And it's very interesting that if you were using IT 15, 20 years ago, maybe with the exception of malware, some of these terms were not even in a dictionary. Just goes to show you how the landscape has changed. So what is social engineering? Social engineering is a tactic that these advertisers could use, and through them tricking the end user, they want the end user to reveal something sensitive about them. And they could potentially solicit some monetary payment, or worse, they could even gain access to your confidential data. And remember, these days, data is worth money. And because of that, that's why things like ransomware come in and phishing come in and everything else. And by the way, social engineering could be combined with malware, ransomware, and phishing. So you will see a hybrid of all of these in action. So I have 9 bullets that talk about some of the cybersecurity best practices. The first thing you need to do is never say, I'm not going to be a victim of these fraudulent methods. Believe that you are a target. Believe that your devices can be attacked at any time, anywhere. Essentially, that means don't put your guards down. Next, how many times have you heard from your organization, from your employer, that you need to practice good password management? We all want to have everything easy for us. But for those of you who have ever taken a security course, you know there is a curve that shows security and convenience are inversely proportional to each other. The more secure you make something, the less convenient it's going to be, and vice versa. So as for how does this apply to password? Typically, you want to make sure you don't use the same password multiple sites, because that means if the hacker gets hold of one of the accounts that you're using, they know the same password works on those other sites as well. You never, ever want to share your password with users. And the reason I put this down here, don't write them down, and no post-it notes, is because of something I ran into several years ago. This is a true story. As a consultant, I was working with a reinsurance company that handled millions upon millions of dollars of transactions. And one day I was working to fix a executive's computer. So I asked the executive to go ahead and log on. He said, you don't need me to log on. I said, well, what is your username and password? He said, if you look on my monitor, the user ID and password are posted there. We laugh at this, but this is true. This is not a practice that should be done. In fact, some companies go to the effect that their security officers, their security administrators monitor this, and somebody could be cited for this violation. Now, people are going to be here complaining about, well, I don't want to worry about remembering my so many different passwords. At IBM, we have come up with a secure password vault. They call that 1Password. Other companies have similar things. This way, you only remember one password to that tool, and that tool in turn connects you to the backend systems. This third one also is something that you probably have heard multiple times. Be careful what you click on, especially in an attachment on emails. I can tell you that a lot of companies Do not allow receiving email that includes suspicious attachments such as .zip files, because within the zip files, they can hide lots of malware. Here's the first thing I would tell you. If you do not expect an email from someone, or if the email looks suspicious for any reason, do not bother clicking it, delete it. Even if that email appears from your company's CEO. Think of it this way. Why would the company's CEO ever send you, an individual, you could be an important person too, an email? Be very, and if it sends it, look at the spelling that is done there and find out if there's any characters that might have been changed. Remember that scammers always will look up your information online, and through that online information, every one of us have presence online. They use that to target you within a particular company. Look at the URL, Uniform Resource Locator, of the website you want to get into. You always, again, want to make sure that because of spelling mistakes, you do not get redirected to a harmful domain, which would be too late. Be careful where you plug your computer, whether you're plugging it using an RJ45 cable to an Ethernet network, or worse, a lot of us like the convenience of Wi-Fi. Be careful where your smartphone or your tablet is going to plug into. That could be a trap. Unless you trust that owner of the access point and not somebody that looks like that access point, do not connect to it. Be very careful about somebody giving you a flash drive and you say, oh, look at that picture that's in that flash drive. That flash drive could be filled with viruses. Be very careful if you're attaching external hard drives to your PC. I already mentioned this to some extent. If you're sharing content on social networks, criminals generally go to the social networks to find out their profile about you, and through that being able to find a great deal of information. If somebody puts their password to be their best friend or co-worker, well, hacker can then get that information, especially when you go on vacation. Be wary of social engineering, especially if once somebody attempts to gain information from you through manipulating you. So if somebody sends you email, suspicious email I might add, and they're asking you, well, click here to reset your password, or click here so that the help desk can support you. Before you click on anything, you should pick up the phone, call up your help desk and find out, did they send that email to you? Generally, 99% of the time, they would not have done that for you. And the last piece of set of best practices that I want to go over is be very careful where you browse. Along with email, HTTP browsing, web browsing, is one of the most commonly used applications on the internet, especially if you're using banking or shopping where you have to enter your credit card number. Do not use a device that is in a public environment. You want to make sure you use your own device, especially if you're going to be connecting to a free Wi-Fi at a coffee shop. Be very careful about those Starbucks where they have the Wi-Fi. And I've used them, but either make sure data is properly encrypted, you have additional authorization layer, or just simply do not connect. You probably have heard this before several times, especially if you're in an airport or any other public places. Do not leave your devices unattended. If you leave it unattended, it's like asking somebody, come on in. If you have not locked the screen, that's even worse. Especially if you keep sensitive information, a flash drive, make sure you lock those devices up. You should always be monitoring your accounts for any suspicious activities, as I'm sure you've heard that quite a bit. And again, as I mentioned earlier, make sure you back up your data regularly. I always tell my students in all my classes, backup is like an insurance policy. If your data is compromised, if your hard drive is formatted, you still have your backup, you'll be able to restore it and get going. Okay. So we talked about the fact that mobile computing has gone up, the usage of it. We also talked about cloud infrastructure and have a separate set of slides talking about that. So that means there is more data in transit than ever before. So as you build your cybersecurity protection, these 4 components that you see here should be part of overall design. And if they're not, you need to go back to the drawing board and take a look at them. Your network, and I'm talking about local area network as well as wide area network, firewalls, and there are significant number of the types of firewalls. I'm not talking about the vendors. I'm talking about types of firewall from a configuration perspective, where you put them. Antivirus, which you already touched upon, and something later on we're going to talk about intrusion protection systems, where they perform a scan on your system. So let's talk about data security. You need to be aware of all the risks, whether you send data online or the data as it resides on your machine. And that brings by itself 2 new terms: data in transit, data at rest. When we're talking about data in transit, we are referring to data that travels over Wi-Fi networks, Ethernet networks, through your internet service provider, even undersea cables. If you find that strange, I can tell you for a fact, Microsoft builds their data centers in support of Azure, and they're doing exploratory work on that. They send capsules underneath the ocean and under the sea, because that's a much more efficient way of running a data center. You do not need to spend as much for cooling your data center. The water underneath the ocean would be cool enough. So even satellite communication are the data as they're being transmitted from one continent to the other. So you need to make sure, as you're monitoring your data in transit, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, CIA is, never forget that. Make sure your data is properly protected. Make sure you're using strong encryption. By strong encryption, I'm talking about what's the size of the key that you're using, what encryption protocol you're using. Make sure you're not using outdated and unsupported encryption protocols. Because the whole idea of using strong encryption is, if attackers intercept data, can they decipher it? Or are they going to say, it's not worth my time, I'm going to go after somebody else? When we talk about data at rest, we are referring to data that actually resides on PCs, on cell phones, on databases, on servers, USB drives, and even DVDs. And as much as possible, data at rest means data is going to be encrypted. As a good example and a policy, I can tell you that at IBM, for our Windows 10 machines, laptop computers like the one I use, we are mandated to use BitLocker as disk encryption. And the trend these past few years, you can say from 2013 onward, has been that we move from storing data on our local data center or local storage to the cloud. Even individuals store their data in the cloud. Whether you use tools such as Box, which is what we use at Toro, or whether you use OneDrive for Business at Microsoft 365, that's referred to as storage in the cloud. So that means even though data is residing in the cloud, we consider it as data at rest. But again, you got to make sure that that data is properly protected. So what are some of the threats that are presented when you bring in personal mobile devices? And by personal mobile devices, I'm talking about smartphones and tablets. Insecure web browsing. You want to make sure websites that you're browsing have HTTPS, meaning SSL over HTTP over SSL. Make sure that that's encrypted when you see the padlock icon on your browser. either on the top or the bottom, depending on the version of browser you're using. You want to be very careful about your insecure Wi-Fi connectivity. Another threat is keep an eye on your devices. Lost or stolen device that hold your company data could mean lots and lots of money to the hackers. You want to make sure your application downloads are not corrupted, applications installs are not corrupted, which causes availability issues, which causes user dissatisfaction, which considers productivity lost. You want to be careful about missing security patches. I think most of you have heard that second Tuesday of every month, Microsoft issues patches. They call that Patch Tuesday. Sometimes if it's a patch is critical, they might issue it sooner than that. So you want to make sure you properly test these patches and you are not running in a situation where missing security patches are in your environment. And as you can imagine, you all see that Apple and other phone manufacturers typically upgrade their devices once every 1 to 2 years. So if you upgrade your personal devices, do you make sure that those new devices carry the same security as the old ones? And something that carries quite a bit of danger with it is use of location services where somebody can find out where you are. So there are 3 principles that we talk about: stop, think, and connect. Stop means make sure security measures are in place. Think means think about the consequences of your clicking on something, of your behavior online. What information are you going to share? And connect means you want to, once you have stopped, once you have thought, then you can connect your devices with peace of mind. So let's talk a little bit about these mobile devices. We talked about the fact that security of these mobile devices become a challenge, the fact that we want to make sure that our end users are properly educated on the risks of any mobile devices. There are some guidelines that you can tell your users to do, and some companies will require to do. For example, there has to be a device locking pin. Originally used to be 4 digits, now it's gone up to 6. And typically after a certain number of times, device locks itself up, won't allow you to use it maybe for half an hour, 1 hour, etc., etc. We talked about device encryption already to death. Here it is again, as far as mobile devices are concerned. A very important feature that I'm going to talk about in a minute, courtesy of your mobile device management software, is implementing remote wipe, which means if a mobile device is lost and is in the wrong hands, through mobile device management, you can wipe the data on that device. So at least you know if the device is lost, the data is not compromised. And that by itself brings us into the concept of MDM, mobile device management, and mobile application management. And there is yet another term that has been introduced the last few years, and that's Unified Endpoint Management, or UEM. The job of MDM and MAM are to distribute and control access to apps, as well as control and distribute security to your machines. So let's pick up on that. The reason you want to deploy MDM is to make sure your devices, your mobile devices, properly managed centrally. Not only that, they're managed remotely. So this means we are going to administer your mobile devices such as smartphones, tablets, laptops, even desktop computers for that matter. And typically MDM is done through a third-party product. Here on the right side, you see a typical portfolio of the most common devices, even though majority of them I would think are going to be Mac, iPhones, and Android. You will find still remnants of BlackBerry as well as Windows mobile devices. In fact, I'm currently working with a client of IBM where their mobile devices are all BlackBerry devices, believe it or not. They do not use iPhones. At least iPhones are not supported in their environment. So this is a typical mobile platform. And these mobile portfolios that you see are typically managed through MDM. So what are some of the examples of MDMs? VMware makes a product called Workspace ONE. Microsoft has Intune, which runs in the Microsoft 365 cloud. IBM has a product called MOS 360. So let's talk about, again, best practices or safety tips for mobile devices. First and foremost, we already touched upon this, make sure your devices are secured. Before you download an app, before you install an app, before you play the games that are now becoming more and more popular, or even your contact list, be careful what app you are using. Be thoughtful about who can get that information from you. And this thing's about now you see me, now you don't. Some stores, some locations look for devices that have Wi-Fi turned on or Bluetooth turned on. And because of that, they can track your movements, where you're going. So when not in use, when you're just walking around and you have no need for it, turn off your Wi-Fi, turn off your Bluetooth. Otherwise, you're asking for trouble. Some more. Get savvy about Wi-Fi spots in terms of where you connect to it. Or even if you connect to a Wi-Fi because it's going to give you access to the internet, make sure next you go to your virtual private network, VPN, from your device to a company VPN on the other side to make sure everything is properly encrypted before you access your email or financial services apps. It's very important. I think I sound like a broken record when I say this. You want to make sure all your mobile devices and apps on them are up to date. You do not want to leave them vulnerable. And again, sometimes it's true, software manufacturers make boo-boos, they have problems, but majority of the time, you want to make sure you have tested these and you update your systems. And here's another example. You should delete something when it's done. You sometimes download an app, maybe because you want to plan a vacation, and guess what? Pandemic hits, 14 months in a row, no need to go on vacation. We don't need this application anymore. So guess what? It could be vulnerable. You want to reduce the attack surface. Reduce attack surface means we want to have as few components that are subject to attack as possible. And that application that you have no need for it anymore could be a good way to reduce your attack surface if you remove it. And we already talked about Intune Workspace ONE as far as being an MDM to manage your mobile devices. Internet of Things, or IoT. So first of all, a definition. What does IoT mean? IoT refers to a systems of computing devices, and I have posted some of them in here, as you can see. Maybe it's a video recorder, maybe it's a microwave oven, maybe it's some kind of appliance, maybe it's my gaming console, device in my home, thermostats, electricity, everything that you see right here, and everything being controlled centrally from our devices. So, and by the way, they're also present in automobiles, heating, air conditioning controllers, and everything. And interestingly enough, they give you the ability to transfer data over a network without human intervention. So that means it has created convenience. Because it has created convenience, if you heard me mention it earlier, that means it's also brought major security challenges. So how do you secure these IoT devices? These IoT devices have access logs, which show who accessed a particular IoT device at what time for how long. You want to secure these access logs and centralize them. Again, we talked about encryption. You want to make sure that these IoT devices are using encrypted protocols. TCP/IP, if you're using, make sure whether it is your remote terminaling into it or anything else, they're all properly protected through encrypted protocols. Again, I sound like a broken record. Make sure for all these devices you use secure password policies, change those passwords every once in a while. You want to make sure you have implemented, regarding IoT devices, restrictive network communication policies. Not everything is allowed. Only allow things that are necessary to do your job. It's a good idea to set up VLANs, virtual local area networks. And the purpose of virtual local networks, think of it as a TCP/IP subnet that is intended to separate traffic from one side to the other. And as I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure the microcode or the firmware that runs on all of these devices is properly updated. Manufacturers typically update their firmware every once in a while, maybe because they have found security issues, maybe sometimes they find productivity features. So it's good to keep these devices up to date. Okay, now we're going to switch to 3 additional attacks that you need to be aware of. And interestingly enough, this DNS spoofing is something I talk about in my MSIS 641 course. Man in the middle, or MITM, distributed denial of service, as this picture shows, and DNS spoofing. So have these pictures in mind as we go through the next few slides. What is DNS? DNS is what has made our life easy on the internet. If you want to connect to your email, all you have to know is my email is called gmail.com. My email is called mail.yahoo.com. And there you go. I do not need to remember a string of IP addresses. So guess what? That means DNS can become a primary target for hackers. So DNS is this hierarchical name system. If you're familiar with the file system in Windows or Unix or Linux, you know that there's typically a root file system. Underneath there, there's folders or directories and so on and so forth, as many layers as necessary. DNS naming follows the same convention. A name such as www.toro.edu has a computer name, which is www, in the domain Toro, in the top level domain of edu within the root domain. DNS, because it provides significant amount of that in network information to threat actors, will be the focus of attacks and is already the focus of attack by these threat actors. How so? Hackers will try to do DNS harvesting. They try to harvest as much information, because through DNS, I can find out what computers are in your network, what are their IP addresses, and through the name of those devices, I can probably understand that this is going to be email server, this is going to be a file server, this is going to be an application server, and try to come up, usually through reconnaissance, whether passively or actively, I can find out these things about your network. So how do they do the DNS harvesting? There is a utility in TCP/IP called Whois, and this is a query response protocol. You can query for domain names, you can query for IP addresses, you can query for internal contact information for websites. In DNS, you have DNS servers that provide you with zones. Within the zones, you have the records of DNS records. The zone information gets transferred from a primary to a secondary DNS server through a process called zone transfer, based on a frequency and based on a schedule. So you want to make sure that a DNS server is not misproperly configured, so somebody puts in their own rogue DNS server in between, and through this zone transfer, the information gets in the wrong hands. And last but not least, as far as harvesting DNS is concerned, we want to talk about network administration tools. Windows has a tool called NSLookup, which stands for Name Server Lookup. Linux has a tool called DIG. There's also another tool called traceroute, or traceRT rather for Windows, traceroute on Linux, and the same thing also on Cisco routers as well. And through these command lines, you can try to receive zone information, zone transfer. So you want to make sure that unless a particular DNS server is authorized, we're going to talk about how that happens, they should not be able to receive that DNS zone information.